Let's ask everybody's favorite question in light of the expanded playoff report. Will Notre Dame consider joining a conference?
You are Locked On College Football with Spencer McLaughlin, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in this, the greatest sport on planet Earth. Kansas State, Baylor, who do you trust more to be a Big 12 title contender this year? You might know the answer to that by the end of this show. But first, Tyler Wojak of Locked On Irish is here because, you know what? Why not keep asking the question that we've pondered in this sport for, 40 years, Tyler? Will Notre Dame ever join a conference? Do they need to? Well, in light of this report, this question came into my mind. For those who are not familiar with the report I'm referring to, the discussions are ongoing amongst the SEC and the Big Ten, who control everything in the college football playoff beginning in 2026. Sounds crazy, but actually true. And they're proposing, potentially, a 4-4-2-2-1-1 format. 4 bids automatically for the SEC, 4 for the Big Ten, 2 for the ACC, 2 for the Big 12, 1 for the Group of 5, and 1 for Notre Dame? I guess, Tyler, would this change their thinking at all with regards to, hey, maybe a conference championship's a good idea?
No, I don't think that this new format is going to incentivize them to join a conference. Now, I have made it pretty clear, as I've been asked over the years, like forever is a long time. I do think that eventually something will happen where it will be more beneficial for Notre Dame to join a conference. But frankly, I don't think that's coming here in the near future. And I think that, we can criticize the process here, but I think that when they created the 12-team playoff format, Jack Swarbrick, the former Notre Dame athletic director, probably knew where this was headed and that the 12-team format was going to be short-lived because the contract only went through 2026. And once it got to that point, I think he had the foresight to recognize that it's probably going to expand yet again to 14 and potentially 16 teams. And he is a big part of how that was constructed. And I think it was always in the back of his mind that this was going to happen. And he made sure that Notre Dame was going to have a spot in that scenario. And I think that's exactly what it is. That one at-large spot would probably go to Notre Dame because I think that they would have an automatic bid if they were to finish in the top 14 in the CFP rankings or the top 16. So I know that it's going to come up, but frankly, I don't think it changes anything.
Is it right that Notre Dame, while getting to make their own schedule every year, and it's kind of a mishmash of the ACC, and there's a couple Big Ten teams in there sometimes, USC is always in there, for instance, but mostly it's kind of an ACC adjacent schedule. Is it fair that they get essentially their own playoff spot that nobody else can really influence, or that nobody else could snatch? Because if Notre Dame's the opportunity, it's just going to be to them, right?
In a way, personally, I don't love the schedule, or I guess the open marriage, you can call it, that Notre Dame has in the ACC. And this might upset some of your ACC fans, but back when I was growing up, Notre Dame would play Michigan every year. They played Michigan State every year, and they often played Purdue every year. And there was just a lot more juice with those matchups, at least on the Notre Dame side. And I would also say on the Michigan State and the Michigan and the Purdue side as well, there's history there. There's no history with Notre Dame and Wake Forest. There's no history with Notre Dame and NC State or North Carolina. So I have actually been pretty open to the idea of Notre Dame eventually joining a conference, specifically the Big Ten, because even though they're technically partners with the ACC, I don't think they'd ever actually join in football. I think that if they were going to join in football, it would be with the Big Ten. So I understand why some people might look at it as Notre Dame is creating the spot, but think about it. 4 bids for the Big Ten or the SEC, it's very possible that the Big Ten could have a down year and you could get in that 4 spot and definitely not be deserving. So I don't particularly love this format, and some people might not love the fact that Notre Dame has a spot, but they play a pretty tough schedule. This year they open up with Miami on the road. Then right after that, they got a home game against Texas A&M. Then a couple weeks later, they got to go on the road again at Arkansas. So that's 2 SEC teams and then one of the best teams in the ACC just to start the year.
Yeah, and What I wonder about I love Notre Dame's schedule this year. I think the Miami game is one of the most high profile, entertaining non-conference games. Storylines are going to be everywhere. I'm all about having those particular matchups early in the season. But what's interesting about this for Notre Dame that you kind of touched on there, Tyler, and I want to go further into is the idea that, being in the Big Ten might actually get you better access to the playoff than being where Notre Dame is now, where we don't really know what the margin for error is. But in the Big Ten in a given year, 9-3 gets you there. It would. And playing the bottom teams in the Big Ten on a rotating basis, I think in a given year, you could have a schedule in the Big Ten that is easier to get to 9-3 and get in the playoff than whenever they would need here. Because we don't know until this, officially happens, of course, first of all. But until we see it all play out, we don't even know what Notre Dame needs to get that spot that's essentially just specially reserved for them. I mean, is it 10-2? Is it 11-1? Do they have to be ranked inside the top 14? Like, where do you think that cutoff is?
Well, I think that if and when this becomes official, there will be a carve out for Notre Dame where they'll say if they finish, let's say it's a 14-team playoff. If Notre Dame finishes in the top 14 of the final CFP rankings, that will qualify as their automatic bid. But then it becomes subjective because it's not like Notre Dame has to finish in the top 4 in the Big Ten or anything like that. So what would put them in the top 14? That's a bit harder to forecast. And I know that a lot of people, after watching this college football season, have jumped to the conclusion that going forward with NIL and the transfer portal, that there's going to be a lot more parity every single year. You're going to see some teams sneak in that you otherwise would not in the past. That could end up being true. I'm not ready to say that's what's going to happen just yet. And
why not?
Because it's only 1 year. We have 1 year.
1 year of the 12-team era, but we've had a couple years now of the portal and NIL.
Right, but even in those years, it wasn't like there was a ton of parity or there was like all these new faces coming. I mean, Michigan.
The SEC hasn't played in the national championship game in the last 2 years. Do
Right.
you think that's just a coincidence? It could be. It could be. I'm not saying they're going to miss it forever. I think there is a bit of curious timing that once NIL and the portal became a thing, the SEC failed 2 years in a row to even make the national championship game.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Like, it could be right. I'm not ready to say this is definitively what is going to happen because I think there's going to be a bit of a counter, like teams like Alabama who are looking around and they have plenty of resources down there as well. And they're thinking, hold on, this team isn't making the college football playoff. Money's going to start coming in. They're going to be more aggressive in the portal. And I think that it could course correct. I think that basically predicting the future based off what, like you said, 2 years of the NIL and portal, I think that I'm just not ready to do that. And maybe these people, maybe everyone who has that opinion ends up being right and that this small window is a glimpse into the future. I just think that the teams with the most power and the most resources are eventually going to figure out and get back to dominating, maybe not in the same way before. Like, I don't expect to see another Nick Saban run at Alabama where they just completely dominated everyone else. I don't think that's going to happen, but like Georgia's probably going to figure it out. Alabama's probably going to figure it out. They're going to be right back there in the mix every single year where it's going to be harder to sustain that for all the other schools. But maybe that doesn't end up being the case. Maybe with the NIL and the transfer portal, it is completely spread out. I also think we should bring up the fact that revenue sharing is going to really change the game, how teams or really how universities go about handling that revenue sharing process, which I do believe will pass on April 7th. Like, all of that is going to factor into the equation, and that's going to change things up way more than we could probably even imagine because we knew that NIL and transfer portal would have a big impact, and I don't think anyone expected what it turned out to be. So I guess I'm just a little bit hesitant to make all these projections for the future going off just such a small sample size.
Tyler Wojak, Locked On Irish, great as always. Will Kansas State be great again in the Big 12? Is that a given? Could they be the best team in the Big 12? Just don't forget about the Wildcats, okay? First, a reminder of this episode brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was, past tense, dealing with piles of paperwork, frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Now taxes is, present tense, easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation. An expert who's backed with the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back, guaranteed, all while you go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting, none of that. This is taxes, present tense with TurboTax. Intuit TurboTax. That's where you want to go. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile apps. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. TurboTax.com. Kansas State, Big 12 title contender. Yes, I fully believe that. I'll tell you how they do that in a moment. But first, the Big 12 title race is something that at times I love more than life itself, because the way that it gives you this unpredictable nature and a vast array of teams from all over the place that could go win it, it's wonderful. It's beautiful. It's poetic at times. And you know what? I'm here for it as long as they want to have the conference set up like this. So, Kansas State, going into next year, brings back Avery Johnson. And that's a pretty important factor when you return a quarterback, because when you look around college football next year, this was not a great class of quarterbacks that are being sent off to the NFL draft. There were plenty of good players. Of course, Shedeur Sanders, Cam Ward, those sorts of guys. But the number of returning highly productive quarterbacks in college football, few and far between. You can find quite a few in the good old Big 12. Guys like Jake Retzlaff. Guys like, you're going to put Sawyer Robertson in there at Baylor? Sure. That's coming on tomorrow's show, not later today, but more on that later. Arizona State, Sam Leavitt, he was really good. Texas Tech, Baron Morton, well, he's crazy talented. So once again, for the second straight year, if you're going to win this conference, you have to have more than just average or slightly above average quarterback play. Who met in the Big 12 championship game this past season? Who was it? Oh, that's right. Iowa State, Arizona State. You had Sam Leavitt in there, who was one of PFF's 2 or 3 highest graded quarterbacks for the entire season last year. He did that under the radar because Cam Scadaboo deservedly got a bunch of attention and Heisman hype. But Sam Leavitt was really good. Really, really good. Lost his best receiver going into that Big 12 title game, who was on fire. It didn't matter. Did not matter. So he was really good. Now, Avery Johnson doesn't have to become that level of passer because he brings a dynamic element on the ground that most quarterbacks can't even dream of being able to accomplish. That's what makes him special. His ability to run is unique in this conference and in a lot of conferences. He is Lamar Jackson light. However, he has to get better. You are not going to give yourself the best chance to go and be a Big 12 title contender if you don't have the ability to make big throws. And what I felt was missing from Kansas State's offense this past season was a reliability on third down for Avery Johnson to deliver when you know the ball's going up in the air. If you can rush with discipline as defensive coordinator, you can do a lot against this Kansas State offense. Because if Avery Johnson can't break contain, he wasn't that dangerous. Now, this past year, he threw for about 2,700 yards, 25 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. I'd like to see him cut down on the second number, yes. 58% though. Now, that doesn't sound like a big number. That's because it's not. I expect him to take a step forward in his second full season as a starter. But then I thought about, well, what did the other Big 12 quarterbacks do? How far away is he really? Now, Rocco Becht was only about 1% better completion-wise in 2024, but was a more productive quarterback from a yardage standpoint. He threw for over 3,500 yards. So Avery Johnson is not completing a high clip, and he's also not having a bunch of downfield shots, or that is not something that Kansas State really wants to do. But still, that step forward needs to be there for Kansas State. And if they have that, guess what? I've seen Chris Kleiman win this conference before. That's when Texas was still in it. Remember when Texas and Oklahoma were members of the Big 12? Those were great times. Great times indeed. A special, rightful time, might I add. But if Avery Johnson takes just a step, it doesn't have to be a huge, monumental gap not gap. If he doesn't have to take a monumental leap forward for Kansas State to be right there and capable of just going out winning the Big 12. FanDuel's got their odds as tied for the best with Arizona State, largely because, I believe, of Avery Johnson being there. Returning quarterback production, that's essential. You got to have a good head coach. And how does your schedule look? Well, the front half for Kansas State, pretty darn favorable after their first game. That matchup in Dublin, I don't know why it's being played in Dublin, Ireland. It's the Aer Lingus Football Classic. Okay, all right. August 23rd can't get here soon enough. Kansas State, Iowa State. Huge, wide-ranging implications in that college football game. Phenomenal early season matchup, conference game that early in the year. Don't see that very often, but alas, there we will be on August 23rd. So Kansas State, Iowa State start off there. That's a tough matchup, but it's easier than going to Ames because both teams are going to Dublin, and we'll see what happens. But then there is a stretch where Kansas State should expect to win every single game. They should have a W5. They should. North Dakota, Army at home. Don't you dare overlook the Knights, Kansas State. I will not stand for that. At Arizona, who, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not that high on them. UCF, first-year head coach Scott Frost at home. Yeah, that should be fine. Then at Baylor. Now, Baylor got hot at the end of last season. Was going to talk about Baylor on today's show. A little scheduling conflict popped up. We bumped that segment to tomorrow. Stick around if you want to hear about how I feel about the Bears and how Cam Stewart of Locked On Baylor feels about them as well. That could be difficult. Game is in Waco. Then you come back home against TCU. You go at Kansas looking for a bounce back. Then the gauntlet arrives. That entire stretch after the Iowa State game is so manageable. It's so workable. And last year, 7-2 got you into the Big 12 championship game with the right tiebreakers in there. It's so workable here for Kansas State. Again, if Avery Johnson is the same runner and stays healthy and just takes a baby step forward, if he just completes 63% of his passes instead of 58 and hits 3,000 yards through the air, I think Kansas State finds themselves in the Big 12 championship game in the conference of parity. That's what we're dubbing the Big 12 here. But the gauntlet arrives once November hits. That's when it will be gut check time for Kansas State. Hosting Texas Tech, one of the best rosters in the Big 12. Could be in the Big 12 championship game. At Oklahoma State. Can get crazy. It can get wild at Boone Pickens Stadium. Then at Utah. Ooh, boy. Now, there is a bye in between the Texas Tech and Oklahoma State games, but back-to-back weeks on the road at Oklahoma State, at Utah, come back home against Colorado to round out the regular season. I don't think that's a problem. But those two road games, massive, massive for the Wildcats. You win at least one of those, you're in good shape. Earlier this week, I went on my guy JT Wistersill's Locked On Utes podcast, and we discussed this expanded playoff. What does it mean for Utah and the Big 12 writ large? It's not great. They don't really have a choice. We get pretty candid with our thoughts. Here's what that conversation sounded like.
Spencer, diving right into this. The reports from Ross Dellinger that the Big Ten and SEC want to expand the playoff, and they want 4 auto bids for their conferences. I'm going to get right away to what I think of that. I think it would be the worst thing to ever happen to college football, and it's probably going to happen too. So I'm incredibly disgusted by it, and I think it just ruins the competitive spirit and fabric of the sport. If just because you are in that conference, even if you finished 4th, you're automatically in and you don't have to earn it. That doesn't sit right with me at all, and I genuinely believe it's the worst thing that would ever happen in the sport.
Well, you know, the counterpoint, I am against it, first of all, just to make that very clear for the Big 12 fans listening to this out there, because, you know, Utah, Big 12, classic Big 12 are out there. But, like, the worst thing ever, boy, it's up there. Like, it would definitely be up there. The counter argument to, well, you know, they wouldn't have to earn it is, well, they did earn it. right, in this hypothetical world in which, the fourth place team in the SEC and Big Ten get in. Well, they earn it by getting to the fourth place in the Big Ten or SEC, which those two conferences obviously view as being more difficult than getting to third place in the Big 12 or the ACC. And, I think part of this, I always get the sense, maybe it's just because of what the narratives of college football have been over the last couple of decades, JT, but I really get the sense this is kind of a USC, UCLA to the Big Ten sort of situation. I feel like the SEC is USC. They're the ones driving the bus and doing all this, and the Big Ten is UCLA. They're just kind of along for the ride and reaping the benefits, but I don't ever get the sense that, maybe it's because of fans, maybe it's my own biases, I don't know. Like, I don't know. That's just kind of the vibe.
It's all the comments that Greg Sankey makes a lot. I think that says less.
Yeah, I do think that's a part of it. The SEC coaches whining about their team. Lane Kiffin going on a week-long tweet tirade about, oh, look at how terrible these playoff games are. Oh, this is so odd. Like, I think it's that sort of stuff. You don't see it from the Big Ten. I think for the SEC, it reeks of insecurity in a huge way because they've dominated the sport for a really long time. And now NIL in the portal, not the 12-team playoff. Not the 12-team playoff. I cannot state that in strong enough terms. That is not what has leveled the playing field closer. There is still a gap, no doubt. No doubt. But the SEC doesn't just have its champion getting to the national title game every year. 2 years in a row, they haven't made it. It's not that they will never make it again. They absolutely will. That's common sense. But there has been a shrinking of the gap. And so the SEC, I think, has felt its grip on power football of, hey, it's us against the world. No one can touch us when our teams are, really, really good and winning whoever our conference champion is, just the de facto national champion. That doesn't exist anymore. And so this, I think, is a snap reaction to, hey, you left our 9-3 teams out of the playoff, and hey, we're kind of having a problem getting to the national championship game. It's like,
but they're not.
The SEC's a 65-year-old guy, and this is Viagra for them. Like, it's just not as easy as, I'm sorry if that's too crude, but like, it's just, like, that's what it is. That's what it is. They're trying to grab on to what the past, what they want it to be like it used to be, but it's not. But I understand where their heads are at, and money is, of course, driving a huge part of the bus. But anyway, I'll end my rant for now and let you actually ask me a question.
First of all, your Viagra joke, you've been spending too much time with the Big 12 squad.
I agree. I blame the Big 12 squad.
Yeah. And second, like we say a problem, it's only 2 years. Like, we're so reactionary with college football sometimes. I feel like it's the same. Like, so often there's the fire everyone media where as soon as a coach struggles, it's like, oh, the solution is to fire him. And Ohio State fans said Ryan Day, they wanted him gone, went on to win the national championship. So I just think we just get so reactionary. I think that's the problem too. And
yeah.
Okay.
But here's the thing. When you have those fundamental changes in the early evidence to the SEC is, hey, this is causing our power to weaken, you don't want to let that snowball. You're not going to sit and wait for it to play out to see, well, maybe not. Maybe it didn't. No, once you get a sense that Iron Throne has lost a little bit of its stability, you do whatever it takes to chisel that thing back to the proper level of strength and support that it used to have.
And that's fair. They've lost a little bit. I don't think it's a problem, but you're right. In their eyes, they do, because they want to be the top dog. And I think, Spencer, why I get so frustrated about this, and I know first of all, if they just, when they expand to 16 anyways, more times than not, the top 4 Big Ten and SEC teams are going to be in there anyways. But just on the off chance that there is 1 year where there's only 3 good SEC teams and the conference beats up on each other, I just don't want that 4th team to get in, just because I don't want, like, I just saw already how the narrative was spun against the SMUs in the world, like how hard it was for them, even though they lost a heartbreaker to Clemson, like, to still get in. And we're just trying to more and more separate, when I know that they want us to think like, hey, this gap is massive. And yes, those teams are good, but SMU got blown out just like Tennessee did on the road. So that's where I just get.
It's amazing how often we forget that, isn't it?
Yeah. I just really struggle.
Brush, like Kirk Herbstreit, just brush it off. He was in the post-game wrap up in the television booth where he called Tennessee getting blasted into another dimension so hard Doctor Strange had to pull him out of that dimension and reinsert them into the universe they belong. And he was sitting there talking about Indiana getting blown out and saying, well, they just focused on wins. I'm like, what? Like, think about this, JT. Tennessee was 10-2 with a road loss to Arkansas.
Yes.
Who lost to Oklahoma State. Yes. Now, Arkansas was a perfectly fine team. They were 6-6. Okay, whatever.
Shout out.
But again, not a great loss. Even on the road, they were 2 touchdown favorites, and they lost outright. That Tennessee team at 10-2, we didn't ponder, well, they shouldn't be in the playoff. Can you imagine if 10-2 BYU in the lowly Big 12, which is just so far away from the SEC, if they'd gone to Ohio State and had a similar sort of outcome, which they probably would have, by the way, because, well, Ohio State was ticked off and really good. Can you imagine what that discussion would have sounded like? I don't even like thinking about it. No. It would have been so repulsive. But again, they just get so much benefit of the doubt. And for the last 25 years, that's been my entire life. It's been warranted. But now it's not. I've always been a proponent of SEC bias until the last couple of years. Yeah. You can tell me whatever you want about on paper results. Texas was not the SEC champion. They only lost once in the regular season, but they were the SEC runner-up, and they should have lost to Arizona State. They were 1 play away from doing that. The SEC champion last week of the regular season, Georgia, they lost. They almost lost in 8 overtimes to Georgia Tech, who was an average ACC team. You kept telling me about this gap, and I watched the gap exist for my whole life. But for the last couple of years, it hasn't been there. But they don't care, and they want to tell you otherwise.
They do. And even like, I can already see a year from now how SMU and Indiana's playoff performance will be brought up. When I will argue the game that was the closest to being the biggest blowout was the Tennessee one. The Tennessee
100%. Tennessee had the largest margin of defeat of any first-round playoff team. Any of them.
The interception in the end zone, too. Like in the first half, too. Like, let's even look back on that. If Tennessee doesn't pick off Howard in the end zone, it goes to 28-0. That's no other team trailed by that. SMU was in it. Indiana was in it closer than that. So, and I'm not trying to make this just about a Tennessee thing. I'm just trying to make it about, hey, I don't want these auto bids just because you're in a conference when these other teams have clearly deserved to play.
And I don't want the record. I don't want the regular season games to just not have the same level of meaning, which we've already diminished. But this is taking it a huge step further.
It is. That's why I don't want to go to 16, Jay. I wanted 8. That's what I wanted. What did you? Do you want 6? 6. I like 6. You were originally not even for expansions. That's an improvement.
I would have gone back to the BCS before I went to the 12-team playoff.
Ooh,
I still would.
I can understand that. I maybe would rather go BCS. I don't know if I would, but it's just the way that the sport.
I would go back to the BCS before I expanded the playoff any further. I think tough. 6 was the right number.
It's crazy, and there might even be talk of super conferences, so this isn't gonna slow down anytime soon, unfortunately.
Yeah, as always, JT and I, we don't hold back. That's not how we roll. Hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time, and until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.